Hello everyone, we're so glad you can join us for this live web presentation. Myhurst University and Equid Network are excited to be able to offer horse enthusiasts a science-based series of courses on horse breeding and selection. The series consists of 4 online short courses coupled with 4 live web presentations featuring nationally recognized experts. This is the 4th live web presentation of the series, and tonight we're excited to welcome Dr. Jason Turner from New Mexico State University, who will be presenting on the topic of postnatal care. Just to tell you a little bit about Dr. Turner, he grew up in the green country of Oklahoma in a small rural community with family ties to the quarter horse racing industry. This fueled his interest and desire to pursue further study of horses through 4-H and FFA activities. These experiences led Dr. Turner to pursue his bachelor's degree in animal science at Oklahoma State University. He then obtained his master's degree with a focus in equine reproduction and a PhD with a focus on equine health. Dr. Turner has taught equine science and horsemanship courses in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, North Dakota, and New Mexico. He has conducted clinics and horse owner workshops in several U.S. states, Switzerland, Germany, and the Czech Republic. He oversees a very active teaching and extension program at New Mexico State University. He also serves on many national committees focusing on research and youth, as well as adult educational programs in the horse industry. Aside from his career as New Mexico State University professor, Dr. Turner has judged youth open and breed association shows in several states and in Mexico. Before we begin, we would like to thank our sponsors, Purina Mills, Horsetech, and Iron Spring Farms. Please feel free to ask questions pertaining to the slides during the presentation. You can use the text box below, and we will also have time at the end of the presentations for questions and answers. Please welcome Dr. Jason Turner.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me now. If you can't hear me, please write in on the chat, or if you're having problems with your equipment, please let us know so that we can make sure everyone can hear. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. You know, I have the wonderful opportunity to talk probably about one of the most enjoyable parts of the horse industry, and that's whenever we get to work with our new foals and those weanlings, so we can see that all of our hard work is paid off through the breeding process. I want to begin tonight with a couple of lesson objectives that I put together, and these I feel are the key things that I hope all of you will be able to do once we've completed this online course. The first one being that you will be able to describe the normal parameters for foal development from birth up to the weaning process. And then secondly, be able to develop a timeline for pre-weaning management of your foal and plan for the actual weaning process of your foal. So those are our 2 key objectives that I want you guys to have in the back of your mind as we approach this. In terms of our outline, I am going to take a chronological approach in terms of presenting the information, and we'll look at the foal's first day of life, then the foal's first week, then we'll move on and talk about the pre-weaning management period, and basically there I'm talking about 1 to 4 months of age. We may extend that out if your weaning date isn't going to be until 6 months of age, but that's what we're going to refer to as the pre-weaning management period. And then we'll talk about the specific weaning process and then make some final summary comments. So I thoroughly encourage questions. I hope you all have a lot of questions for me because this is a wonderful topic to discuss. I would like you to try and save the questions until the end, just so that we can get through the information. And I think as we go through, some of the stuff early on will be reinforced in later slides. So if you can save the questions till the end, just write them down and we'll address all those at the end. When I was asked to put this talk together, one area that I asked about was how much do we want to talk about the actual foaling process and the immediate postpartum period. And the emphasis was to be more on the pre-weaning management. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing the foaling process. I do want to refer you back to the article that was published in Equus. I think there's a lot of good information for you there. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to point you towards some different online resources that I've reviewed and I think will be helpful in supplementing what we talk about here. So in terms of that foal's immediate postpartum period or first day of life, probably the most important thing that we have to do as horse owners is be able to assess what is normal versus what is abnormal. If we don't know what normal is, it's really hard to determine if it's abnormal or not. So again, in the Equus article, I think it does a really good job of talking about the foal's behavior and what you can expect to see and when you can expect to see it relative to foaling. Also, it gives you a good overview of the foal's normal vital signs and how they'll change somewhat early in life. The second thing in this immediate postpartum period is that we need to disinfect the foal's navel. And roughly we want to do that first at about 30 minutes post-foaling, whenever it's a good time to get in there with the mare and foal and do that. And we want to continue that daily for about 3 to 4 days of age. And that can be done relatively simply with what I have shown here on the right. This is an empty syringe casing filled with a chlorhexidine or Novosan solution, and you can simply place that over the foal's navel, push it up flush to his abdomen and shake it around and disinfect that entire area. And it's really nice and simple to do. The third thing I have shown here is we want to collect a colostrum sample, and that's what the picture down here represents. This is a picture of when I was managing the horse farm at Kansas State University, and we collected colostrum to save for our colostrum bank, but also we collected it to test the colostrum so that we could determine how much antibodies are in that colostrum. So we're just simply milking the mare out by hand and collecting it into a small plastic bag. Once we have that colostrum collected, then we're going to evaluate the quality of that colostrum. And the means of doing that, we utilize what's called a colostrometer. And it's this piece of equipment here shown to the right, where it's basically a graduated cylinder filled with water. We take a portion of that colostrum and place in this chamber and then submerge it in the water. And the metal rule up top here, I know you all can't see that, but it has graduated markings on it with numbers that indicate the specific gravity of the colostrum. So when we look at the specific gravity of the colostrum, what we consider to be an acceptable level is anything that is 1.06 and above. The reason being is that specific gravity of the colostrum gives us an idea of how much IgG or immunoglobulin G is in the colostrum. That is the primary antibody in the colostrum that is passed from the mare to the foal to transfer immunity from the mare to the foal. So with 1.06 specific gravity, we can expect a correlated value of 4,200 milligrams per deciliter of IgG in the colostrum. And that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about the passive transfer of immunity other than the mare has good quality colostrum. If we were up here in less than the 1.04, which you will see sometimes, we can expect that that colostrum does not have very much IgG and it would not be sufficiently transferred to the foal. The final correlation we can make based upon some of these research studies is that if that colostrum is 1.06 or greater at 24 hours of age, the foal should have approximately 800 milligrams per deciliter of IgG in their blood serum. And that is the real important number that we want to look at. It really doesn't matter how much is in the colostrum. The big number, the important number, is what the foal absorbs. So one might ask, why is this important? And the reason many people will do this is to collect that colostrum immediately after birth. And like I said, you can freeze it and bank it and use it to give to another foal if the mare has poor quality colostrum. The other thing it allows us to do is evaluate that colostrum, and if we find that the mare has very poor quality colostrum, it gives us a few hours to look for an alternative source of colostrum, or perhaps consider our options in terms of having synthetic IgG that we can administer to the foal. So like I said, the important number that we're concerned with is how much IgG is in the foal's blood. So roughly at about 12 hours following birth, we're going to take a blood sample on that foal and conduct a test. And as I mentioned previously, if the mare has good quality colostrum, the foal nurses well, and so on, we should have adequate passive transfer of immunity, or transfer of the antibodies from the mare to the foal through the colostrum. And adequate passive transfer is considered to be anything over 800 milligrams per deciliter in the foal's serum. The next category would be what's considered partial failure of passive transfer at 400 to 800 milligrams per deciliter. And partial failure of passive transfer, you can look at it as these are a group of foals when compared to our adequate group. They may be expected to have an increased incidence of infection or maybe bouts with sickness, as opposed to our adequate group that receives good quality antibodies. And then the last group in terms of passive transfer is what's called FPT, or failure of passive transfer, and those are those foals that have less than 200 milligrams per deciliter of IgG in their serum. These are the ones that are going to be most prone to subsequent infections and bouts of sickness and so on. So we really want to make sure that these foals get started off on the right foot at birth. The graph shown here on the right is just from some work we did here at New Mexico State in the past couple of years, and we measured serum IgG on foals from birth through 180 or 6 months of age. And I put this graph up here just so that you can kind of see what happens with those serum antibody levels. The IgG is going to be absorbed roughly through about 24 to even 48 hours of that foal's life. After that 24 to 48 hour time point, the foal's intestinal wall closes down and does not allow the antibodies to cross and enter the serum. So this bar representing 7 days of age, we can see that that antibody level is at its highest point, and that is due to the transfer of those maternal antibodies. Then over time, these antibodies will decrease, and then they begin to increase when the foal's immune system takes over production of its own antibodies. So that just gives you a little idea of what's going on with the foal's immune system. The important thing to realize about colostrum and the serum IgG is that if we start very low over here around birth, it's just going to get progressively lower, and that's why those foals may be more prone to disease. The other thing we want to do in that immediate postpartum to first day period is we want to check to make sure that the foal passes his meconium, and that is simply the first feces, and oftentimes this happens without any problem. But in some cases, foals will have a hard time passing the meconium, and they can even have an impaction type colic resulting from that. So what I have shown here on the right is a simple disposable enema that some people will use to help the foal pass that meconium. The other thing during this first day of life, I think it's important that we try and observe the structure and movement of that foal. Oftentimes we have some complications with how the foal was carried during the pregnancy, or some things that may have occurred in the birthing process, and the foal will have some structural abnormalities. They may be really weak in their pasterns, or they may be really upright in their pasterns, or they may have some weak joints throughout their body. So in terms of this, I would tell you from my experience to err on the side of caution. And if you have concerns about the foal's pasterns, if they're really weak and walking on their fetlocks and so on, we definitely want to make sure that we provide them with adequate stall rest and help them develop before we turn them out on pasture, when the mare is going to run across the pasture and the foal is going to be expected to keep up. So this, as well as other health concerns, if you've got any questions about that, I would definitely refer you to seek out veterinary evaluation so that it can be evaluated on a specific basis. One of the things I'll mention throughout our talk today is relying on our powers of observation. I think the most important thing that we can do to plan for normals and so on is to observe that foal. So I strongly encourage you during this early time period to observe that foal and keep track of these things. If you have more questions about the foaling process and what you need to do to prepare for that, I put a link here to the EquiSearch article on the foaling checklist, and I think that will kind of help point you in the right direction if you have further questions. One common question I get, whether it be a phone call or email from producers, is about imprint training, and that is the concept put forward by Dr. Robert Miller. And I have conducted imprint training with farms that I've been on and done the opposite and not done that. So there's a lot of questions, and I just briefly wanted to touch on it in terms of advantages and potential disadvantages. So the question being to imprint or not to imprint, and the advantages put forward are that foals bond to humans and see the humans more as a herd leader, and that's definitely helpful as we go to working with those foals later in life. The other nice thing during this time period, when the foals are relatively easy to handle and they're kind of a captive audience, so to speak, we have the ability to sensitize them or desensitize them to certain stimuli, whether it be pressure on the body, it be a plastic bag, a set of clippers, and so on. So those are some of the advantages put forward for imprint training. Some of the contrary points, I guess, that I wanted to bring up is that research reports looking at imprint training versus other handling methods have reported that imprinting does not appear to work any better than the other foal handling methods studied. That's not to say it doesn't work, or it's better, or this one's better, and so on. It's just reports that they're similar in terms of the responses that were measured in the research studies. I think the question to imprint or not really is something that each individual owner is going to have to decide based upon the resources they have available as well as their time. But if you are interested in learning more about imprinting, there's a nice chat transcript available on the EquiSearch site that Dr. Miller conducted a few years ago. As we progress through our timeline and look at that foal's first week, I wanted to bring up a few things that are normal and we should be expecting to see, as well as some of the management practices we need to consider. And I've already talked about dipping the foal's navel. Again, we need to continue that through about 3 or 4 days of life. In terms of nursing, we can expect these young foals during that first week to nurse about 7 times per hour. And that's going to gradually decrease over time. So at 4 weeks of age, a foal can be expected to nurse about 3 times per hour, and by 4 months it will be down to about 1.5 times an hour. So that is the frequency of nursing. It will decrease over time. However, what happens on the other side, the length of each nursing bout increases. Again, we want to make sure that we evaluate our normals during this first week of life and make sure that the behavior of the foal shows that he's thrifty and vibrant. It's definitely okay that they lie down, take a nap frequently. That's to be expected. However, when they are up, we want them to be alert and really vibrant, not show any signs of lethargy or illness. And it's important to be familiar with our vital signs in case we need to check anything there to make sure that the foal is doing okay. One common concern, particularly of new foal owners, is that of foal heat scours. And foal heat scours are going to occur around 5 to 15 days of age, and it's associated with the mare's first heat period following foaling. The most probable reason for this occurrence has to do with changes in the foal's digestive tract. So it's going from working with amniotic fluid, the colostrum, and now moving on to milk. And there's going to be a shedding of that internal lining. There's going to be some changes in enzyme function and so on. So that's the most common accepted reasons for foal heat scours. Again, like I said, this is normal, and it's not something we would normally have to treat unless it persists for more than 3 days or the foal becomes dehydrated. And again, I'll refer you back to the Equus article. It talks about the skin pinch hydration test, and that's a real simple, easy method to detect. Finally, in our first week of life, it's important to remember that this is one of the first times or opportunities that the foal begins to taste and possibly even consume small amounts of solid feed. So if you are feeding your mare some type of grain, it's a good idea to feed him on the ground in a feeder that the foal can access so he can become accustomed to the grain source. Also, during this first week, as soon as that mare and foal have bonded, barring any structural problems or other needs for stall rest, it's important to get that foal integrated into his social structure. It's important that he develops a bond with other horses and fits into the pecking order of the herd so that he can fit in with other horses later in life. An example I would give you of this is when we consider orphan foals. For those of you that have been around orphan foals, most of their social structure has to do with the human handler that shows up to feed them throughout the day. They're normally segregated from the rest of the horses, and so we'll see them develop quite a few abnormal behaviors, I guess, and be more bonded towards humans than horses. And this can present us a problem later in life as we try and reintegrate them into the horse herd. So if at all possible, even with your orphan foals, if you can find them a buddy or maybe give them some opportunities to interact with the horse herd throughout the day or a few times a week or something, that will go a long way to helping their future behavior. If you haven't conducted imprinting or done any other handling or had any human contact with that foal, this first week is a great time to do it, simply from a size consideration. You know, they're obviously a lot smaller and easier for us to handle at this age than opposed to 3 or 4 months of age. Some of the research that has been conducted has shown that handling early in life, not necessarily in that imprinting post-parturition period, but just handling young foals, definitely increases their manageability and their learning ability later in life. So what I would recommend during this time is to start small, keep it simple. Maybe we start off with the haltering process and get the foal used to having the halter on, and then make a daily progression each day once the foal is comfortable with a new thing. So we can progress on to brushing and then hopefully handling their feet and add a few other things as we go. The main thing I want to stress in regards to this handling is that we need to remember that these guys are really young and have a short attention span, so we want to make sure that we keep our lessons really short and we don't overdo it. So we don't need a 30-minute power marathon on picking up their feet. as little, as possibly 5 to 10 minutes a day, but maybe what we're shooting for. And some of the research out there has shown that as little as 10 minutes a day each weekday through roughly about 2 months of age will have a significant improvement on the foal's learning ability. So like I said, this time period, this handling is very important, but it is relatively small, short learning bouts. Now we're moving on to that pre-weaning management period I talked about, roughly encompassing 1 to 4 months of age, maybe on to 6 months if you choose to wait a little longer to wean. But again, this is an important time period for that handling and socialization. If you haven't done it earlier in life, you definitely want to consider about doing it now. In terms of training, it would be nice if we had our foals halter broke and where they would lead readily while they're young and we can still handle them. I know most of the farriers out there, and particularly my farrier, really likes it whenever they show up to trim weanlings and the weanlings have had their feet handled. So picking up feet is definitely going to score you some bonus points with your farrier. And this is also a good time to work on that sensitization and desensitization. So I will often, work with my foals and get them to move their hip over in response to pressure, get them to move their shoulder, and so on. Desensitization, yet again, we can get them used to a plastic bag or a set of clippers and so on. So just a little while back I told you how important it was that the horse be integrated into the horse herd and develop horse behavior, and that's definitely true. But I think the other thing that we would like to do during this pre-weaning management period is to get our foals accustomed to humans and develop some type of bond with humans, hopefully a enjoyable and pleasurable bond for that post-weaning period, particularly in those instances where you may only have a single mare and foal and the human bond is really all they're going to have after that weaning time. So this is a good time to develop the bond with your foal. I want to shift gears now and kind of lead into talking about nutrition. And I think we need to start off and consider what's going on in terms of lactation with that mare. So what I've done here with these two tables, we're to look at the nutrient density of the mare's milk, shown here in the top table. And this is taken from the 2007 nutrient requirements of horses, and it's based on a 500 kilogram or 1,100 pound mare. And what we have shown are the different months of lactation, so 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and then 2 to 5. And this is based on conservative estimates where we don't factor in a decrease in the amount of milk produced or a large increase in the amount of milk produced. So these mares would be expected to produce about 15 kilograms or about 32 pounds of milk per day, or about 3% of their body weight. What I have shown in the different columns, we have the digestible energy of that milk in megacalories, the crude protein in grams, calcium in grams, and phosphorus in grams. So what I have highlighted in yellow is the nutrient content of that milk, roughly about that 4-month time period when we're going to think about weaning. Down here on the bottom, we've got the daily nutrient requirements for horses with an expected mature weight of 1,100 pounds. So we don't have a lot of research data available for normal foals to look at nutrient requirements prior to 4 months of age. So we start here at 4 months of age, roughly when we're thinking about weaning, and what I wanted to show you were the nutrient requirements of the foals. So we can look at the nutrient requirements highlighted here in yellow and then go back and look at the nutrient density of the milk. And we can see obviously that there is somewhat of a discrepancy about what's supplied. So we need to remember during this time that the foal is going to be consuming grain if it is available and consuming good quality hay and pasture, hopefully. But the thing I wanted to point out is that the mare's lactation isn't totally meeting the foal's requirements, so we need to make considerations on how we're going to supply that supplemental feed to the foal. As we look at changing the foal's diet and consider what's going on in terms of nutrition, there's some obvious changes that we're aware of in that nutrients are being delivered in a different form. So we're going from liquid milk to a solid feed, whether it be pasture or some type of grain. There's also changes in those nutrient sources. The crude protein makeup of the milk is obviously going to be different than a grain supplement that we might put together. And one key point about these changes in foal nutrition early on, the thing we need to remember, just like a human infant, the younger the horse is, the more nutrient dense that diet needs to be. So we need higher levels of crude protein, calcium, phosphorus, and so on. During this time period of 1 to 4 months of age, the foal is also going to be experiencing some changes in digestive function. And one of those big changes is the change in the enzymes produced by the gut to digest the different nutrients. And that is going to change from whenever they're consuming milk to the solid feed. Also during this time, we're going to see some foals, or a good majority of foals actually, that will consume feces of other horses. Normally they'll consume fresh feces out on the pasture and so on, and sometimes this troubles some of the owners. They wonder if they have a nutrient deficiency or a mineral deficiency, something of that nature, but it's actually natural that they do this. The horse is a hindgut fermenter, and that simply means that they digest fiber in the large intestine and the cecum, or the hindgut of their digestive tract. And in order for this fermentation to occur, they have to have microbes or bacteria present within the cecum. So the foal is consuming those feces in order to inoculate that hindgut and to get it to develop adequately. During this time, our basis for that foal's diet is going to be high quality hay, or hopefully pasture if it's available. And then we want to think about providing a creep feed that is specifically formulated for young growing horses. In terms of creep feeding suggestions, I highly recommend it, and one reason is it's been shown that it can help ease the stress of weaning. And we've got some research data here in a moment that will kind of show you why that's so important. The rule of thumb about creep feeding is to start early, roughly about 1 month of age, and begin providing feed for that foal. So we want to start out about a half a pound per foal per day, and then gradually increase the amount we provide going along with their consumption until we reach a point where they're consuming about 1 pound per day for each month of age. And that's a good rule to follow, so that we provide enough creep feed, but yet we don't overfeed them. And when we talk about this amount of feed, we're specifically talking about the grain portion. We're not taking into account any hay or pasture they may be eating. The other thing that creep feed helps with is it helps to stabilize post-weaning growth. If we have that foal on a good plane of nutrition prior to weaning, it's going to help keep him on a level growth stage post-weaning, so that we don't have any growth spurts which can lead to subsequent problems like developmental orthopedic disease or OCD lesions or anything of that nature. In terms of putting your creep feeder together, there's many designs available. You can do Google searches and find a lot of information on terms of how to put one together. Midwest Planning Services is another resource that you might Google to find plans on actually how to build a creep feeder. But creep feeding is simply a means of controlling access to the feed that we provide, and that's what's shown here in the small diagram. We have a simple board rail fence system where there's a trough placed in here to put the feed in. And this fence system allows foals to go under this top rail, but it's not tall enough to allow the mares access in. So the foals can go in and consume creep feed without having to fight with the mares. When you're looking for a creep feed to purchase in terms of commercial creep feeds, I remind you to look at the feed tag and see exactly what's in the bag or on the label bag. And the recommended composition, what we want to look for, crude protein levels of 16 to 18%. That should provide an adequate amount of amino acids and in the type of amino acids that the foal needs. Calcium we would like to see between 0.8 and 1.0%, and phosphorus levels at 0.6 to 0.8%. And the next two nutrients are copper and zinc, and we'd like to see copper present at 10 to 30 milligrams per kilogram of feed, which most commonly you'll see on the feed tag as parts per million. So we'd be looking at something between 10 and 30 parts per million on the feed tag. In the case of zinc, we want to look at 40 to 120 parts per million on the feed tag. So now that we've got our foal on creep feed, he's accustomed to it, he's eating it, what we want to monitor in terms of assessing normal versus abnormal is look at growth and weight gain. So over here on the left, I have some numbers taken from Evan's book, The Horse, which gives the normal percent of mature height for light horses by age. So at 6 months of age, we can expect our light horse breeds to be about 83% of their mature wither height. That's going to increase to about 91% at 12 months of age and about 95% at 18 months of age. And if this is something that you want to monitor, you can simply find a good level surface like a concrete pad and take a wither or hip height stick and measure wither height, or you can use something like a seamstress tape if you have someone help you. Over here on the right is a table that I put together using some research data from Ringler and Lawrence at the University of Kentucky. And what they did was monitor thoroughbred foal growth throughout various ages. So this table shows the actual body weight of thoroughbred foals at different months of age. So we have our ages represented here in the left-hand column. This N represents the number of foals measured at that stage of development or at that age. So we have birth weight data on 340 foals, and we have 6-month body weights on 215 foals. The next category is the actual body weight of the foals in pounds, and then over here on the right we have ADG, or average daily gain of the foals in pounds. So starting off, we look, the birth weight of the majority of thoroughbred light horse foals are going to be around that 135 pound mark. And then when we look down here at weaning, what we're looking at is about 450 pounds at 4 months, 500 pounds at 5 months, and roughly 550 pounds or 560 at 6 months of age. During this time, I want to draw your attention to their average daily gain. This is when they're roughly gaining about 2 pounds per day. And this is when that creep feed or supplemental feed becomes very important. It helps support that growth so that they're not growing, let's say, 1 pound per day of age at 4 months. And then when we do wean them and stick them on feed, maybe this jumps to 2.5 or 3, where we could potentially have some problems. So we really want to try and stabilize that weight gain and have it a nice sequence of events. In addition to the changes that are going on with the foal's digestive system and growth and so on, the other thing that occurs during this time is the development of their immune system. And as I mentioned previously, when we started off, we can look at antibody levels in the foal. And this graph here simply represents specific antibodies that are geared at protecting against West Nile virus. And this pattern of decline is something that we can expect to see for all of our antibodies, whether it be something for influenza or rhinopneumonitis or whatever. So again, they're going to start off relatively high because of that passive transfer of immunity, and as that foal ages, they're going to decrease until the foal begins to produce its own antibodies. And that normally occurs in response to natural infection or exposure to the antigen or infectious agent, or following vaccination. So these foals that were on this research study were not exposed to West Nile virus and not vaccinated for West Nile virus until after 6 months of age. So you can see that progressive decline in antibodies for West Nile virus. At the same time antibody levels are declining, we see an increase in the number of lymphocytes. And lymphocytes are the white blood cells that produce antibodies. So this is actually a good thing that we see antibody levels increasing from birth all the way up to our weaning time period. That means they have a more competent immune system, and they're going to be able to produce more antibodies on their own whenever they are exposed to the infection or vaccination. And these, I would like to point out, are only for illustrative purposes. This is not something that we're routinely going to measure on foals unless we suspect it's a problem. So unless a foal becomes sick or shows signs of some type of disease, we're probably not going to do the blood test to measure these antibody or lymphocyte levels. Now we're getting really close to the weaning process. Roughly we're about 30 days, 45 days out. So during this time period, we want to think about our final preparations for weaning. And the key things I think we need to look at here, one, are health care, and two is our location of weaning. So we'll address health care first. Some things we might want to consider doing this time period are obviously deworming and vaccinations. Deworming, there are several products out there on the market that are cleared for use in foals, and I would encourage you to consult the product literature on that. But the biggest thing I see as a problem dealing with different producers is we have a hard time determining body weight. If we don't have access to a set of scales, it's difficult, particularly if we haven't raised a lot of foals, to estimate body weight. So again, I referred you here to an EquiSearch article that tells you how to go about measuring or estimating that foal's body weight, and it can be done simply, again, with a flexible measuring tape. In regard to vaccinations, this is where I would tell you to consult with your local veterinarian, and that may seem like a canned response, but it's really in your best interest to find out what diseases are prevalent in your geographic area, because they will vary throughout the United States. And I would hate to recommend to someone you don't need to vaccinate for Potomac horse fever when actually, based upon your geography, you probably do. So that's something where you would definitely want to consult with your local veterinarian. Prior to that consultation, the AAEP, or American Association of Equine Practitioners, have a guideline prepared that's up on the web, and I encourage you to take a look at that and read that, and that can help you when you go to visit with your veterinarian about your vaccination program. One of the key things, and I really want to stress this, during our plan for preparing for weaning, the weaning process in itself is very stressful. We don't want to compound that stress or complicate it any further. So our goal with our pre-weaning management program is to avoid stressful situations within 2 weeks of weaning, whether it be pre-weaning or post-weaning. So if you're planning on doing the first hoof trimming or castrating your colts or doing some other type of stressful procedure, I encourage you to try and keep that outside this window. In regards to the location of weaning, we obviously want it to be safe for both mare and foal. It should be readily accessible and provide a good means of observation for us to keep an eye on those horses. If we are going to be moving the horses off of the farm to another location, or a significant move, we need to move that mare and foal to that area approximately 30 days prior to the weaning date so that they can become accustomed to the new area, get settled in, and have a chance to be exposed to any infectious agents there and deal with that prior to weaning so we don't stress them anymore then. Alright, lastly, the weaning process. And to me, I think the first thing we need to address is the purpose of weaning, and obviously it has a management reason in that we want to make better use of our feed dollars by putting that feed straight into the foal and not continuing to have the mare to lactate. So from a management standpoint, we want to improve feed efficiency. We also want to break that bond between the mare and foal so that we don't have a herd-bound mare and foal, and it's easier to manage them as individuals. And that kind of leads to our behavior standpoint. It's important to break that bond so that if our weanling gelding is going to be a world champion barrel racer, you know, we probably can't haul him and mother both around the world. So it's important to break that bond and get them functioning on their own. During the weaning process, like I said, there's the potential for stress, and there's two types of stress that we'll see. One is behavioral stress, which is simply increased vocalizations or whinnying or nickering, or increased activity such as running the fence. So those are behavioral signs of stress that we'll observe. Physiological stress is most commonly measured by evaluating cortisol levels in the blood. And cortisol is a steroid hormone that is released from the adrenal gland in response to stress. So that is our most common measure of physiological stress. When we get to procedures for weaning, this gets to be a little more variable. There's lots of ways that we can tailor the weaning process to our operation. And we can look at the approach in terms of stall weaning versus pen weaning. So over here we've got a box stall setting where we plan to wean an individual mare and foal, and we'll put the mare in a box stall adjacent to the foal. And that is an example of stall weaning. Up top here we have a picture of a couple of small dry lot paddocks, and you can see on this side of the blue fence we have a mare that's standing up there to the fence, most likely talking to her foal over in this pen. And we've got roughly 6 or 8 foals in this pen over here that are on a creep feeder being weaned. So that is an example of pen weaning. The second part has to do with how we remove the mares. And abrupt weaning is the instance where we abruptly and totally isolate the mare from the foal. So in the case of our stall weaning method here, we may have them in the same stall, put the foal in his stall, and then we're going to remove the mare and take her probably a mile away or something so that she's out of earshot and out of sight of the foal. If we were doing that in our pen situation here, we would have our foals in our pen, and then we would take each mare out and again remove her from sight and sound of the foals. That is an example of abrupt. So in the case of gradual, if we're doing stall weaning, we would keep the mare adjacent to the foal for roughly 24 to 48 hours prior to total isolation, giving them a chance to break the physical bond of nursing before they have to break all the bonds in terms of nursing as well as companionship. In the case of our pen weaning, that's really what's illustrated here. This is an example of gradual pen weaning where the mares are placed on this side of the blue fence for 48 hours prior to being totally removed from the foals. The question comes about which is the best for you or which one is right for me. It really depends on what you have access to. If you have good, safe pipe paddocks or pens that you can utilize in this type of setup. And the key point here is with our blue fence, we've actually got 2 fences up there, and that's to prevent any nursing through that fence. You know, if there's any nursing taking place, we're not achieving our weaning goals. So which is best for right for you depends on what you have available to work with. As I mentioned, in terms of physiological stress, cortisol is our most common measure of that. And this graph illustrates a weaning study we did at Kansas State a few years ago, where we abruptly wean foals, represented by the white bar, and we gradually wean foals, represented by the black bar. The abruptly weaned foals were immediately isolated from their mares. The mares were taken approximately a mile away, so they were out of earshot and eyeshot of the foals. The gradual weaned foals had fence line contact, but no nursing with their mares for 48 hours prior to removal. So as shown here on day 2 of the study, those mares were removed from the gradual foals. And the reason I really show you this is to give you an idea how the pre-weaning period can affect weaning management. So normal plasma cortisol levels in foals of this age are around 40 nanograms per milliliter. And what we typically see in stress foals, we see that going up to 60 or 80 nanograms per milliliter. And as you can see from the graph here, the foals in this study, which I think it represented about 14 foals, all stayed right around 50 nanograms per milliliter. And to me, although our study can't prove that, my observation would lead me to believe that our intensive handling of these foals and working with them in the pre-weaning period made it easier for them to break that bond with their dam because they had access to human companionship. If we look over here on the right, I think this graph will drive home the importance of a good creep feeding program. And what is shown here is average daily gain in kilograms. So roughly 1 kilogram is equal to about 2.2 pounds. So if we look at the time period 30 to 23 days prior to weaning, they were gaining about 2 pounds a day. And they remained around this 2-pound mark until weaning took place. And we look here in the post-weaning period, that 2 pounds of average daily gain has basically gone down to 1 pound through about 10 days post-weaning. And that's probably due, one, to their increased activity. They're more active, they're burning off more calories, but more importantly, they have reduced feed intake due to the stress. So if we already have them accustomed to eating creep feed and weaned onto that, we're sitting very well here to managing them in the post-weaning period. So to wrap up, if you've got further questions about weaning, again, there's a really good EquiSearch resource that offers some supplementary information to this. And before we summarize, I want to leave you with a few key comments about the post-weaning period. And one is to keep the foal on the creep feed that they're used to. This is definitely not a time that we want to be changing their diet around. Our whole goal is to keep them eating normally and keep them on feed. So also to that end, we want to keep them on the good quality hay or pasture that we've been feeding them. And then once we have the weaning bond broke between the mare and foal, whether it be in a pen setting or a stall setting, we want to provide that foal in the post-weaning period unlimited free exercise. Obviously, we want it in a safe area. But this does two things for us. One, it's going to improve their manageability and behavior while working with their human handlers. Obviously we don't want to stall sour foal because they're harder to deal with. But more importantly, the stress on the bones, the exercise that they get is important for normal bone development. We have to build those bones up, break them down, build them up again for normal bone development to occur. And like I said, I think the most important thing we can do is continue to monitor the growth and feed the foals accordingly. So refer back to your benchmarks for height and weight standards. And then the other thing is we want to remember that we want to keep these foals at a moderate body condition score of 5 or 6. We definitely don't want to get them obese during this time period because it will predispose them to a variety of metabolic problems potentially on down the road. And one more resource provided for you in terms of body condition scoring foals, and this is a really neat little supplement that can teach you that very quickly. So in summary, first few weeks of life, it's important to know what's normal and expected. If you're a new foal owner or this is your first foal you're expecting, I encourage you to seek out assistance from an experienced source. And then again, set aside that time to monitor that foal during the first few weeks. Make sure everything is occurring normally. During our pre-weaning period, this is where we want our sound feeding and health program, get them started on creep feed, and continue to monitor the performance. And then during the weaning period, the best advice I can give you in a nutshell is realize that it's going to be stressful for both the mare and the foal and even the horse owner. So be prepared and have a good plan. And lastly, we're all in the horse business to improve our quality of life and enjoy life. So above all, make sure that you enjoy your new arrival. So in the immortal words of Porky the Pig, that's all, folks. I want to leave you here with the references that I used in putting this together, so you can feel free to take a look at any of that information. I know we went a little bit over on time, but I will be here to answer any questions that you may have, so please let me know. Okay, our first question. It says, will a poor colostrum mare always have poor colostrum, or can we change it with better nutrition? And that's a really good question, because actually I've seen the colostrum quality on mares change from year to year. Generally, I would say a mare that has 1.06 colostrum will typically have 1.06 colostrum, but it may change the next year. And I haven't seen anything that really has tied that to nutrition. Obviously, if a mare is really thin and on a poor plane of nutrition, she's not going to have the nutritional reserves to produce antibodies. So in theory, that could affect it, but that would be in those severe cases. So honestly, I don't think there's much you can do other than having a good normal feeding program that will improve that. So the second question says, can we get a copy of the web addresses? And Sunny just popped up, said we will have a recording of this presentation that you can access through the course site, and that is the case. So I apologize for going too fast, but I wanted to make sure we got it all covered. But this will be posted up on the website where you can access it. Any other questions? Okay, our next question. Okay, I've got to back up a little bit. We had two come in at once. It says, if we can do weaning at 6 months, would you recommend it? In my opinion, that 4 to 6 month range is perfectly fine. It's really where you want to set your date and have that weaning occur. In some cases, I've even weaned foals at 3 months of age, but they were doing very well, and I set up a good creep feeding program before I did it. So there's nothing wrong with waiting until 6 months to wean those foals either. So it's really up to you. Next question. Can the foal's immune system be built up prior to foaling by providing quality nutrient-rich food to the broodmare during gestation? Plain and nutrition is very important for normal development of the fetus. But is there any supplements that we can feed to improve that? Not necessarily. The foal's immune system is really transferred from that mare to the foal through the colostrum. Foals are basically born with a non-functional immune system. Once they ingest colostrum, they ingest the antibodies. They also ingest some other factors that help turn on the foal's immune system. So that's another reason that colostrum is so important. But there's really nothing that we can do other than feeding a good quality diet to that pregnant mare to ensure that foal is born normally and with a sound development. Okay, next question. How soon should the foal pass the meconium before knowing when to give an enema? And I would say that's something that it's going to vary quite a bit between foals. I guess what tips me off to considering giving that foal an enema is if they're really straining, trying to pass the feces, and they don't get it passed. So, I would let them strain for a little bit, maybe try 2 or 3 times over the course of an hour. But if they're continuously straining, trying to pass the meconium, and they can't get it done, then I would go ahead and give them an enema to help aid that process. Okay, next question. How long will the foal system accept the mare's antibodies? Was it 7 days or 7 hours? And I know we went through that really fast, and basically the foal's intestinal tract allows antibodies to cross it somewhere up to 24 or 48 hours of age. So we want to get the colostrum into the foal as soon as we can. We measure blood serum levels of IgG roughly about 12 hours after getting that colostrum so that we can see what's present in the foal's system, and hopefully that gives us a few hours if that IgG level isn't very good, where we can give the foal supplemental colostrum or synthetic IgG prior to reaching that 48-hour mark. So basically, long story short, the intestinal tract remains open pretty well through 24 hours of age, but is definitely closed by 48 hours of age, and all the research will pretty much support that. Okay, next question. Do you know if there are more or less post-weaning stress depending on their age? In this case, 4 versus 6 months. And that's a good question, and to be honest with you, off the top of my head, I can't think of any research study that has looked at differences in weaning stress based upon weaning age. In my opinion, the 4 to 6 month age is going to be so similar in terms of their developmental stage, whether it be behavior or physiology, that they're probably going to handle it equally as well. As a reference, the graphs that I showed you about the work that was done in Kansas, where we looked at cortisol levels and so on, the foals in that study, like I said, there were 14 foals, and they ranged in age from 4 to 6 months when we weaned them. So they were kind of all across that age range. Next question. How important is pasture to the growth and development of a foal? It's very important. It's one of those deals, if we've got them out there on dry, dormant, native pasture in northern Oklahoma, expecting them to do well, they're obviously not going to get enough nutrients from that pasture. So foals, while we may not think about it or realize it, on our occasional observations and so on, they will consume quite a bit of good quality pasture to help supplement the milk coming from the mare. The problem is that the foals don't have the best developed pine gut, so they're not going to digest all of that forage as well as a mature horse. But it is still an important component of that pre-weaning plan. Okay, next question from Wanda. It says, when do you recommend foaling shots for the mare before foaling for best transfer? And that's a great question. That's one thing that really interests me. So I'm glad you asked that. Routinely, what most people are going to recommend is somewhere 4 to 6 weeks prior to foaling is to give that mare her booster shots for the vaccinations in question. And that's about the right time period to do that. That gives the mare a chance to mount an antibody response. We really ramp up the antibody levels present in the serum, and then the antibody levels that are present in the serum are going to be transferred into that colostrum within 2 weeks prior to foaling. So about 4 to 6 weeks out. Excellent questions. Okay, next question. I had an abrupt weaning process with one foal, and it was really stressful, but just for the foal. She jumped against the stall door, so we had to turn her out over several times a day for nearly a week until she got over it. That's why I asked so much to make a better weaning next time. And that's a good point to bring up, this about it being stressful. Different foals are going to handle it differently, and just because you do the pre-weaning management and have the interaction that I talked about does not mean that it's 100%. You know, these are my best recommendations based upon what I've learned over the years and based upon the research available. So that is definitely something that can happen, and I appreciate your comments there. I've got about 5 more minutes before I have to be somewhere else, but I do want to try and take all the questions we've got. So if there's anybody else that wants to weigh in, I truly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys, and I hope it was informational for you. So if there's any other questions, let's please bring them up. Okay, I don't have any more questions coming, so I appreciate all of you with the nice comments that you made. I hope you got a lot out of this. I know there's a lot of information to cover in a short period of time, but I want to thank My Horse University for providing me the opportunity to visit with you all tonight, and I hope you have an enjoyable evening and a good foaling. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Turner. We appreciate this wonderful presentation, and just to let everybody know, the recording of this presentation will be available through the course by tomorrow. And so if you want to go back and review, you can just go into your course and look at the web presentation details to access the recording. Thank you again so much, Dr. Turner. Everyone have a good night. Bye-bye.